Was asked to do is explain what a tinkerer is. And to me, it's really been central to what I've done on the web for over 20 years, which is just try and figure things out. And starting from studying graphic design to learning to make web stuff in the early 90s and for years, that's always been the heart of the web, is figuring things out. How to do something with technology, how to do something with design. We've gone through different kinds of layout techniques and how to deal with getting type on screen. I used to really pride myself on my use of the lighting effects filter in Photoshop to create really nice type effects, but that has progressed. And when web fonts became a thing, I really kind of rekindled a love of working on the web for me, because it brought all of those things together about design and communication and technology. And when you use them together in an artful way, you can create a really compelling experience. But I also wanted to stop and remind everybody that I am a first-timer here, so please be kind to me. Eve, I'm looking at you. Last week at an event apart, I gave this talk for the first time, and an event apart is, I don't know if many of you know about this conference series in the US, but it's one of those web conferences that seems to have everybody talking about some interesting new thing, and Jen Simmons gave a talk where she coined the phrase intrinsic web design. And that phrase was a really powerful one to me, because it really gets you thinking about designing for the medium in which you are communicating. And Bianca touched on this earlier, and that was a really powerful connection to me in trying to think about how these things fit together. How do you design for a medium while being informed by past ones? So we've spent a lot of time working on how we communicate in writing and in printed matter. And it's still a relatively new thing, trying to figure out how we do that on the web and in digital devices. So this notion of really being central to the medium itself, working on the web and in apps and on devices with small screens and large ones, without giving up our history of how to communicate effectively. So this tends to be how I start to think about this stuff. Which is going and walking with my dogs in the morning. That's how most people tend to know me. That's Tilly on the left there and Tristan on the right. I spend a lot of time thinking about how to communicate well when I'm walking them. And this talk, while it is about typography and variable fonts, it's really about meaning. Meaning that's derived from and amplified by typography and design. So our current state of affairs has been mired in a lot of limitations and a lot of constraints. Some of them are actual, and some of them are really whether or not we've hung on to these things, a residual constraint, one that's really mired in how did we do this yesterday or last week or last year? Because I just gave this talk last week, and I already have 6 or 7 new slides and a couple of really interesting new things to tell you about. So there's a lot of trying to figure out what we should bring from the from the past and bring it into the appropriate context for how we're going to do that stuff today. And I never seem to be able to do this without looking back a lot further. So looking at this book of Psalms, there's a lot of care that goes into how this communication is presented. And a lot of it has to do with how seriously should you take this piece of communication? And the answer is very seriously. And that you can tell, because at the time, making something like this was a tremendous investment in time and effort and passion. Sometimes even the most faded and layered things can still create a compelling experience, like this pub sign in Brighton. Or looking at these drawings from Monotype, really trying to capture all of the different ways we break down and encode rhythm and structure that will define beauty. And it wasn't just happening in type, it was happening elsewhere. So again, going back about 500 years, everything that Da Vinci was doing here was trying to understand and decode what defines beauty in proportion. Looking at it in our human physique, looking at it in nature, trying to figure out what that rhythm is, and of course, trying to encode it in rules. And so this is coming forward to only 20 or 30 years ago, but trying to capture everything about how to set type to create rhythm and beauty and effective communication. And it got me thinking about this. And there was a notion here about type being invisible, that there being this one perfect form of typography for this individual piece of content that doesn't color, that doesn't impart any additional meaning other than the words that it conveys. Now, that's something I don't personally ascribe to, and I'm sure that with the people in this room, we could probably debate it for weeks, months, or another few decades, but that's not really the point. I think the issue is it was something that was held up as a way to do things that was, in her words, kind of the right way to do this. But I think that the notion that there can be a perfect and perfectly neutral system of typography is undone just by the very decisions you make in that process, because it's never really neutral. There's always something that's going to impart. If somebody says, "I love you," this way, the words convey it, but the words don't really seem to mean it. Or you might be a more type-obsessed hipster, and it could look kind of like this. And that has a little bit more flair. Or like so. It has a hand. There's something that's much more human about the way this is conveying those words, and that is the power of type. And that was further reinforced this morning with this quote from Cyrus Highsmith. I think that it is the voice, it is the detail, it's the tone of what's being conveyed, because type is how we hear what we read. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about whether or not there's value in being more expressive in type when we're working increasingly in a digital landscape. If you look at Bruce Kennett's book from his biography about W.A. Dwiggins, everything about this was so carefully done. It's an absolutely stunning book. If you don't have it, go get it, because not only is the work contained in it beautiful, but the book itself is really lovely. We can do most of these things on the web. We can get open type features. We can create a lot of really nice stylistic touches, but it comes at a cost. Because when we're doing this stuff on the web, we have to always balance it with the content getting there in the first place, and then the content changing again tomorrow when somebody publishes another story. So there's tension. There's always these three things kind of pulling around where you've got somebody asking to change the text or set it in a different typeface, and then they want to put another headline in tomorrow, and then engineering says, nope, we got to add more JavaScript. We're pulling the fonts entirely. So that's something that we've been living with when trying to design for the web for a very long time, and we haven't had a really effective way to do that without simply removing voice. We use fewer weights, we use fewer different typefaces, and you end up in these kinds of conundrums. And this really struck me, this was from Rich, about trying to typeset a word in an interesting way. We'd get laughed out of the room. Nobody would let us get away with that unless we get to, call all the shots and it's our own project. So we've ended up on the web trying to find that perfect system, and what we've settled on is a design system of some kind, a pattern library. And so this is from styleguys.io, and you can see that there's style systems there and design systems from a number of very large organizations, many of whom do a wonderful job trying to convey all of the different stylistic conventions and design patterns to use in the website, but only very few of them actually take into consideration the devices upon which it's being viewed. And I thought that was really striking. I could only find two that actually show variation in typographic hierarchy and scale based on screen size. So Shopify does it a little bit, and BBC does a really fantastic job. You can see that they have figured out a typographic scale and system across a myriad of different screen sizes, and that's very much central to what I wrote about in my book a number of years ago, trying to figure out how do we deal with typographic hierarchy on different size screens for dealing with line wrap and dealing with just basic readability. But what we've tried to do is create this one perfect system for our website into which we can pour any content. And if you think back to what I started with earlier, we've created something that has some inherent problems. And so when you think about designing for everything, what came to mind to me was this episode of a podcast called 99% Invisible, where they were talking about the notion of designing for an average. And in this case, they were talking about planes, and fighter planes specifically in the US military. And after World War II, they found that deaths in pilots were skyrocketing, and they didn't know why. But it turns out that in the 20s, they took all the measurements of a bunch of pilots, and they figured out that those measurements were an average, so they designed the cockpit around that set of measurements, and everything was fixed in place. So everything about your arm measurements, your torso, your leg length, everything, they computed averages, they designed the planes this way. When they did some data analysis in the 40s and 50s on the measurements of all the actual pilots they have, not a single one fit all of those dimensions of measurement. So nobody fit the planes. Even if they dropped it down to trying to match on only 3 different criteria out of the 10, only 5% of the pilots were able to actually fit in those sets of measurements. They changed everything. They made everything adjustable. They put in sliders for the seats. They put in adjustments for the harnesses and for the controls. All of a sudden, everything came back into line. The problem is that when you're designing for everything, you're really optimizing for nothing. So that's something that I think about a lot when we look at the web. When we're trying to optimize for any possible content, we're really not designing for any content in particular. So that led me to say this, and it was awfully kind of Microsoft to stick that on their website. Because where we've landed is this one system that will handle any content that has no real expressive value to it. We've just kind of created our own new crystal goblet. So I think this is sort of a recurring theme in my life as a web designer, and I feel like we've kind of landed in our own winter of discontent. And I want to find a way that we can change that and break out of this rut. And when I saw this announcement, it's a year and a half ago now, it very clearly spoke to me about a way to kind of get out of this rut and be more expressive without the technical cost. So I don't really need to explain this much of it, but thank you, John Hudson, for the quote, "One font that acts as many." And in doing so, being able to capture all of these different aspects and axes of variation, that really opens up some very interesting possibilities for us. I won't dwell on this too much, other than I wanted to show you the CSS that goes with it. So being able to actually vary these things and directly within the CSS without writing any programming, with no JavaScript required, we're able to have all of these things happen. And I think the true magic is when you combine them, but looking at them individually, I think, does give us a good sense of where things might go. And this actually is slightly inaccurate because I discovered that yesterday in the working group meeting for the CSS group that's next door, we can actually tie into the same syntax that you would use to specify font style italic. You can specify a degree of oblique, and that is one of the axes built into a number of different variable fonts. So not every typeface will have all of these axes of variation exposed. It is up to the type designer to choose which ones they want to include. But the likelihood is that you'll end up seeing variable fonts that will have at least 2 axes, and that gives you a fair amount, even if it's just width and weight. What CJ Dunn does with this one, actually, this is Levette again, is actual glyph substitution. So his initial build had italics in the same file. He's since kind of stripped those out into 2 separate files, but it's still a heck of a lot easier to load 2 files instead of 12 to get a huge amount of variation. Optical sizing, this is one that excites me a lot too. I know somebody else was talking about this earlier. I do think that this is actually going to have one of the more significant impacts on overall usability. So being able to look at the stroke contrast when it's set at a physically larger size, you have a much greater level of distinctiveness there and sort of exaggerated contrast, which is what was really intended for that larger size. But when you display it smaller, there we go, then it can still maintain that higher level of readability. So I'm going to look at a little bit more of the history of that in a bit, but there's also some much more interesting axes that are being exposed, like grade. This is also something that Bianca was showing earlier, and I think that that has a huge potential for both accessibility and also for just overall performance and ease of reading in different contexts. So having something that can just make it a little bit sturdier and then kind of go back to that finer level of detail. If you think about light on dark versus dark on light, or for lower light conditions like Bianca was showing, or people who have low vision, who just need a little bit more contrast with the text, that you can gain without having to, nothing else will reflow. So I think that's really pretty interesting. And now, granted, Amstelvár having the number of axes of variation that it has is a little bit crazy, because as it was pointed out, not all of us are David Berlow. But having the ability to tailor things a little bit and bring the ascenders and descenders in to be able to set headlines really tightly without getting those ugly collisions is really pretty interesting, and I think can yield some pretty striking results. And of course, I would be remiss in not showing all of the weird things that you can do with Decovar. And this is another image that you've seen earlier, but I think that this is actually one of the best illustrations to show somebody who doesn't understand what goes into a variable font to see it all together. So thank you, Eric, for giving me permission to use this image. But I think that it's important to be able to take something like this and show it to someone who is not a type designer and not a typographer, to help them understand all of the things that are conveyed in here. And you can easily imagine sort of an animation of this showing where the points are and showing the transitions in between. And it wouldn't be a talk about web stuff if I didn't include some code. So one of the things that is really interesting to me about this is how well the CSS world has done in working variable fonts in without really requiring us to relearn everything that we're doing, which means that it can sit in the regular world of the rest of the browsers and websites that we work on without completely upending this apple cart and having us redo everything. Now, this was more accurate yesterday, and then I think it changed. So the syntax is evolving a little bit, but if you use the syntax in the first slide here, that still works in the browsers that are supporting it right now. So there's not a lot of big changes, and then it does work seamlessly. I don't think that was me, was it? I don't know. Okay, there we go. So it's going to tie, some of these axes will tie into existing CSS, so font weight, font stretch. We're sorry, type designers. I know that's not a good word to use, but and font style, italic, or a degree of oblique, and then setting the font optical sizing. You can turn it on or off, but you can still reach in if you want to and set a specific value. So there's a lot of flexibility that's been built into working with CSS that gives us access to a tremendous amount of variability without requiring that we load other assets. And then you can see these all together using the standard registered axes of width and weight and italics and optical size, and then anything else that you might define. And you're going to see some examples of other axes defined that are really pretty incredible and kind of open up your thinking to what is a font, what is a typeface, and how does it interact with the user over time. And that's a really interesting concept to me. It really does challenge the notion of how we communicate and what typography really is. Now, support for it has actually come along really well, and it's actually growing and changing pretty much every day. It's supported in the operating system in a bunch of graphics applications. It's shipped in Chrome and Safari on the Mac, Chrome on Windows as well, and it's going to be released soon in Edge, and then it looks like it will ship in June in Firefox as a full release. But it is on by default now in the nightly builds of Firefox. So we actually have a lot of access to this, and based on how the CSS spec was written, we're able to actually start using it now, using something called @supports or feature detection to put it in your CSS now, start using it on a production website, and then as browsers come online and support variable fonts, they'll just start getting the new CSS, and you don't have to go back and change anything at all. If you're interested, in the PDF of the slides that I'll tweet out a link to it afterwards, you can go and participate in the discussion. So any of you that are more web-focused and really want to participate in helping shape the direction of this, it's highly encouraged. We really need more people to participate in that discussion and show support to the browser vendors and the W3Cs so that we actually know what's important to us. One of the things that really tickled me about being able to participate in this somewhat recently was the number of people that chimed in on these issues about hyphenation in Chrome. Was one of the motivators in actually shipping a hyphenation dictionary in Chrome. They had support for the CSS, but they didn't have the dictionary, and it was because of so many web designers and developers coming and commenting on this that it really helped influence the development of the browser itself, and it solved a real thorny challenge. It wouldn't be a variable font talk if I didn't include Axis Praxis. Thank you, Lawrence. This is one of the places you can go and play. If you haven't done that yet, although I suspect many people have, Nick Sherman's site has been adding variable fonts, seems like weekly. He just added a whole bunch just in the last few days, others that have been released. So I know there are some people in the room that are involved in some of those, which is fantastic. Monotype also just open sourced this repository where you can go and download this and run a page locally and just drag and drop a variable font onto it, and it will show you what all of the different axes of variability are, and you can play with them, and it's a little type tester, so you can just type in that box. So that's something that you can grab and use yourself or put up online to showcase your own variable font. So that's a little bit of a quick start there. Microsoft put up this page about variable fonts that is an absolutely fantastic reference. It's also beautifully designed, so there's lots to learn there. Type Network, likewise, has been working on something that we've been working on some demos of that last week. There's more to come there, but it shows some interactive demos that you can play with. And this was one of the really cool things that I got to announce last week, is that Firefox is working on developer tools for fonts. So they have a font panel in the developer tools, but in the nightly build, you can enable a little bit more. And this is just kind of a sketch. This is what they're working on to create an interface for people using the browser to actually see all of the different, both OpenType features and variable font features in the browser and actually expose the controls to play around with them. And I got this an hour ago, that it just started to land last night in the nightly developer builds for Firefox. So this is early. They're still hoping to ship it in June, but this stuff is really happening. Browsers are really working quickly to try and bring more tools in and help us help type users and web developers and designers reach in and work with these features, because it does address a huge amount of need in the web design world. I also have something else that I'm able to announce today, which is really pretty exciting, which is this, Roboto. Type Network and Google have been working on this, and in terms of wanting to have some really good, well-designed, well-constructed typefaces, this is showing the standard, and this is showing the variable font version. And hopefully we'll be able to circulate this a little bit more widely. For now, it's just a couple of slides that I can show you. But I think it's happening. It's coming. There are some really fantastic typefaces that are in the works. Some of them will be open source. Some of them will be commercial. But there's actually things out there that you can use now. So that's really, really pretty remarkable. And what I wanted to do is to put that in the context of what kind of value this could bring just to existing websites by changing from standard fonts to variable ones. If you look at the ESPN website, it's loading 4 different weights of Benton Sands that it weighs in around 200K. If they were to replace that with a single variable font, now this is open to debate, and Dave Crossland's probably going to completely contradict me, but I believe that you would see nearly a 50% savings in file size in changing that out. and they wouldn't be constrained to only using 4 weights. The Wall Street Journal, likewise, is loading about 10 fonts at around 600K. So being able to replace that with a variable font would increase their ability to express in a similar manner to they do in print, which we're online right now, it's a little bit more constrained. Again, if they could replace that and cut their font load, even if it's only by 20% or 30%, and gain a limitless variation to create a greater level of hierarchy with their stories, that would still be a huge win and really differentiate what they're doing versus any other media site. Quartz.com actually is one of the better sites that I've seen in terms of their typographic hierarchy. They really do a beautiful job, and they're very expressive. They are loading 4 weights of Adele Sans and 4 of PT Serif, and they're loading both Latin, Latin extended, as well as Cyrillic and Cyrillic extended. So that's a lot of file size that's being loaded, and it would be a pretty quick win for them to replace those with 2 variable fonts and then have even more range. It's a pretty beautiful site. You should definitely check it out. It allows people to eat their cake quickly, which is really kind of nice. So I think even before we get into the real meat of what's amazing to me about what we can do with variable fonts, there's still a lot of benefit that it brings just to replace what we're doing technically by loading these different assets. So I think it's a pretty bright future. The real value, though, I think comes in how we can change how we think about typography for reading. And that's something where you really have to readjust and think about seeing something new or for the first time. I mentioned writing about this earlier. This was an article I wrote for the Typecast blog a few years ago, where I was looking at very specific proportions of body copy to different heading sizes across different device breakpoints. And that was still a pretty static mentality. I mean, it was novel at the time to be thinking about the headings will be this proportion to body copy on a phone and something else on a tablet and something else on a desktop. It was effective, but it was a little crude. And it was still kind of mired in my own education as a graphic designer. I saw Jen Simmons give this talk a few years ago using viewport units to scale type, and that was really interesting, but it didn't quite click to me. So viewport units are essentially something that concretely scales with the viewport, the window size. So 100 viewport width units will always be 100 no matter how big the window is. So there is a predictability about how this works in width and height. And then Tim Brown from Typekit wrote this article about CSS locks. The idea being there's a lower limit in size for, let's say, heading copy or line height, and then there's an upper limit in how big you want it to get based on how big the screen is. And using some modern CSS techniques with variables and calculation to create a typographic scale that just scales smoothly. And that started to click with me when paired with variable fonts. So what I ended up doing was creating a system, and this is actually all up on CodePen. I'll give you links to that if you want to play with it, where you assign some of these basic variables about the breakpoints in the screen and the lower and upper sizes, and that's expressed in ems. So 5 times the body copy size or 10 times the body copy size. And then at the low end on the small screen, you use the variable to set the type size. And at the high end, you do the same thing. And then in the middle, and I know this is a bit of a headache to look at, something like this will actually calculate, based on screen size, a smooth progression from the low end to high end, anywhere in between. So the largest desktop size gets one set of proportions, the smallest phones get another, everything else just gets a smooth progression in between. And you can impact an awful lot with that. So in looking at what's going on here, this is the sample page I was mentioning. So as the screen gets smaller, all of those things have been impacted smoothly from one screen size to the other. So we've changed font size, the width, the optical sizing, the line height, and the height of the ascenders and descenders in the headline, so we can get a nice tight headline there at the smallest size. And then font size, the width of the characters, the optical sizing, and the line height have all changed in the body copy. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting is when you set it on a smaller screen, and you would typically get with your normal Arial, Helvetica, Verdana, whatever it is, you'd end up with maybe 35 to 40 characters per line on a typical phone. By narrowing those characters just slightly, you can end up with 50 plus characters per line. So you get a much more readable line length without really sacrificing legibility. Couple that with optical sizing and you get slightly sturdier character forms. You can really dramatically improve the reading experience without really sacrificing anything or having to load a different asset. So that was something that I thought was really pretty fascinating. And it meant that there was actually very little code. I mean, there was some headaches that you might get looking at those calculations, but everything else is just changing some variable names. So actually adapting this whole system to other typefaces and other typographic systems is relatively straightforward. I did want to come back to optical sizing, though, and show a little bit more of how that's working on the web in a little bit greater detail. So obviously, I would start with something from the 1700s. This was a type sample printed by William Caslon in about 1720 or so. And if you look really closely, you'll see that if I normalize for size, the stroke thickness in the 6-point version is really quite a bit heavier than it is at the larger 72-point size. So what I've done on the right there is basically force optical sizing off. And now if you see it together, you can see what a dramatic difference that makes. It really looks a lot more polished, a lot more refined when you have the optical sizing interacting with the type size itself. And the way that's been done so far in the browsers, the intent is that optical sizing will always happen automatically. It will be defaulting to on, so you won't really have to think about it that much, but you can still set it expressly using font variation settings. So that, I think, is kind of an undiscovered win. A lot of people, it's not really what they're focusing on when they're just talking about width and weight, but optical size, I think, is going to have a huge impact on readability on varying screen sizes. So looking again at character width, looking in the English and German. Now, bear in mind, I don't speak German. I apologize. I just copied this from somewhere else on the web, and I know that that character is not included in the typeface. I'm sorry. I know there's kind of a risk doing this in Berlin, but one of the things that I thought was pretty interesting in looking at this is, again, when you narrow the characters slightly, you can end up with a little bit better line wrap without using justification. I mean, if you are, it's still going to be a little bit better. I do have hyphenation enabled on the left in English. I do not have it enabled on the right. I don't know how well hyphenation works in German in different web browsers, so I decided to leave that one alone. But again, it really does do some interesting things. And as Bianca was showing earlier, again, being able to play around with the grade on light versus dark, you can make it just that little bit sturdier. And this is something that will vary with different typefaces. But with this one, I found that it made the typeface a bit more readable and a little bit less spindly when you bumped up the grade. Or if you're in a more normal scenario, even for somebody with low vision, you could expose a control for them that could allow them to gain a little bit more contrast just for their own user preference. So I thought some of that stuff was pretty interesting. And that's really just focused in on readability, just general improvements in the way people can read text on a digital device. But it doesn't really stop there, because we also get some improvements in basic bits of UI. So we can use text grade to create a stronger contrast in hover elements and buttons without having to reflow or worry about the size of that element changing. So it gives us a little bit more to do. Because all of these attributes are animatable, you can have a little bit more visual interest when people are interacting with the UI. And I would be remiss in not showing what Mandy Michael has been doing. If any of you are familiar with her work on, she's posting a lot of stuff on CodePen and stuff. I thought this was pretty fantastic, and I really wouldn't want to miss out on the chance for her to get her joke told by proxy. She just wanted to do this to actually get people to watch grass grow. But that's just kind of a funny little thing that I wanted to show, but I think it does highlight the fact that variable fonts do a lot of things well to improve performance and create better typography on the web, but that's not the only thing it can do, and that's good. Because sometimes just adding a bit of whimsy or a little bit of extra interactivity and visual interest is exactly what we need to emphasize a piece of content. It shouldn't always be about just the very sort of cut and dried, needing to make sizes and weights and everything a little bit smoother. We need to push it, though. And this is something, and this is kind of a third important area for me in this talk, is that just making a better reading experience is great, but that's not pushing web design forward. It's not really pushing our thoughts on design in a new or better direction. It's just simply a better version of what we've been doing all along. So, in doing things, little touches where we want to ensure that we can do things like get a better setting of the headline, we want to avoid things like this, these little ugly collisions. So we want to be able to tailor the type a little bit. So having a typeface where we can, in a display face, tuck the ascenders and descenders a little bit to create more of a solid set of that headline, I think is an important thing to be able to do, and we want to think about how we can apply these new superpowers that we have. Or tying it into simple controls we could build into a content management system to typeset something in a more interesting way, tying into viewport units to size it so that it scales in an interesting way as well. And again, this is another demo that I'll be able to put up on CodePen if anyone wants to play around with it. But trying to think a little bit more deeply about what does it mean to design for the web is not to end up with a series of sameness. And that's really what Bianco is showing. There are some individual moments in some of the articles that she was showing us, but when you look at them from a distance, you can't really tell. And that's a shame. We have ended up in this sort of sea of sameness. But if you look at the Wall Street Journal in print, there's a lot of things going on there typographically in terms of creating hierarchy and informing you what the most important stories are. But if you look at it online, there's maybe two. So they've lost a little bit of that voice, and they're not really communicating as clearly about what story is most important on that page. And when you take that away, you start to lose a little bit of the power of that publication in the first place. And because we've been trying to optimize our web world for portability, we want to take all of our news and keep pushing it out to all these different places. What ends up happening is when we ship this content off to one platform or another, the voice doesn't go with it. So when you end up looking on Facebook trying to figure out what's a news article and what's not, you really can't tell the difference. And this screenshot on the left from Apple News is only a little bit better. It includes a very small logo there, but that's actually pretty easy to miss. So when you end up taking away the context, you decontextualize the news. You remove some of the signifiers that tell you why is this piece of content more believable than this one? What is the authority, the authenticity that comes with this story? Well, for anybody that knows type and knows branding, it is the typeface in which it's set. And there's some very important signifiers that come with us when you see the black letter across the masthead, when you see a particularly distinctive heading typeface like Irwin from The New Yorker, you know exactly what you're looking at, and you have things in your mind that connect to why you should believe that piece of content. So when you do that, you end up with like the red Solo goblet from Facebook, or blue if you want it to be more on brand. And I think that's a really dangerous place for us to be, because that's where you end up losing out on a significant portion of the believability of that content. And I live in a country right now who has fallen victim to this, and I apologize for what it's inflicted on the rest of you from Europe, but this was a really interesting thing to me. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Blendle platform. It started over here in Europe. They did launch a platform in the US. And what I find really interesting about this in this same topic is they use branding and type from the different publications. So while they unify it when you look at it on the homepage, when you go in to look at an article, it feels like you're looking at that publication. but I've got one place to go to create my curated list of news, and there's very small payments for me to pick up the articles that I want to read. But they present it in a way that lends that same credibility. When you see this from the New Yorker, you know that's the New Yorker. And another interesting little side note here is by paying my 20 cents to get the article that I want to read, I don't get advertising either. So you get a much better reading experience. It's still the tailored one that the New Yorker staff designed, but I get to have it in this other place where I want to consume it. So they've taken that content and shipped it along with its voice. And I think that's maybe something we should be thinking about more when we're working on these web platforms that gather up content in order to really present that hierarchy and authenticity. But back on our own websites, starting to build variable fonts into what we do on a day-to-day basis, there's a lot more that we can do than just build it into the theme where we design once and that's how every page looks. We can actually build controls into the content management system itself. So this is Gimlet from DJR, and I built this quick demo in Drupal to allow you to go in and make a few simple changes and essentially typeset these blocks of type. And I think there is a much better way that we saw earlier today that I think is kind of amazing. And really, I think points, at least for me, it sort of points in the direction of the kinds of tools we want to build into a content management system to typeset a headline. So we can get from a universal typography that has to work with all of the content that we put in the system, but then be able to design the specific. And when we have this specific headline, build in some controls like that that allow you to kind of tweak and copy fit across different breakpoints. So I made a demo, I didn't do all of this today, I promise, where I kind of took, and this is kind of the intent, to be able to go and with this headline, imagine having those controls from Sahar and Jose's talk, to be able to copy fit that headline. We're using viewport units to scale it and CSS grid to control the layout. And I think we could actually create a much more interesting and Wall Street Journal-like experience on the web that's appropriate to the medium, but it still preserves some of the visual hierarchy and branding and authenticity of the print version that I think currently is not reflected in their online presence. Because this was another thing that really jumped out at me. There's no crystal goblet for information either, because information devoid of context and voice does not carry the same meaning or weight. But that's also, again, on online publishing, still only part of the experience. Because there's also this notion of, okay, now we can do these interesting things with type. We have some interesting tools that we can build into it to typeset it. But what about layout? What about thinking about the more interesting kinds of impact that you get? So starting here, I created this sort of fictional page, fictional magazine. We've got a nice big photo, but it would be much more interesting to see how it might work with that photo and text playing together. So adding in a headline, and then adding in a masked out sort of semi-transparent version on top, we could start to create some really interesting layout effects while using real type and just 2 images. So that is also available for you to play with on CodePen. I've got lots of different things that you can play with there. This is just using one variable font to do the entire layout. And then that photo effect was the main photo, and then another one where I just erased the sky. So that would be really simple to create in a CMS to actually create these more polished and maybe a little more visually sophisticated layouts and combine that with the responsiveness of variable fonts in order to tailor it across different screen sizes. So I wanted to show you how that moves and reflows. There we go. I wanted to make sure that was actually, so again, one typeface being loaded to create all of that different visual style and hierarchy, and then it's also responds really nicely as well. So everything is still reflowing. You still get that same overlapping effect with the text in the photo, but it doesn't trap you into something that has to be expensive to create. So your staff, or anybody who's managing the content on the site, is just doing this through a web browser and a little bit of time in Photoshop. So I think that is pretty powerful way to combine these different evolutions in web technology and variable fonts. Because type on screen is exactly what the web is about. I mean, that is very much intrinsically of the web. So it's not really just one form of typography to present this piece of content without coloring it, because I don't think that that's true. It's also not one design system that can present any content, and it's not one form of content that can present any voice. Good typography is intentional, but great typography is meaning. Thank you.